Stand by for your Alaska Aviation Link. We're going to hear all about Soviet pilot, Sigismund Alexandrovich Levanevsky. So in this edition of your Alaska Aviation Link, we're going to talk to Ron Sheardown, famed Arctic aviator, who's been on several rescues in the Canadian Arctic and in Alaska, about a special Russian-Soviet pilot, Sigismund Levanevsky, who was lost in 1937 on the pole.
I think pilots always turn out, even if they're competing companies, when it comes down to an emergency, everybody jumps in and helps. I think Alaska has kept it alive, the search, and certainly a lot of the searches have been done in Alaska, some in northern Canada, as I mentioned before, but mostly in Alaska. I was in Moscow in 1993, and Yuri Selnikov took me over to General Baidyukov's apartment, and I spent 3 hours with General Baidyukov, who Baidyukov was extremely knowledgeable about that flight, and he was there. In fact, they used his charts over the pole for that flight. He told me that the airplane was at 6,000 meters and had a considerable amount of icing. They went lower to 4,000 meters, and the plexiglass in the front of the airplane blew out. The antenna got torn off for the HF radio, and they went to the back. In 1993, I spent 3 hours with General Baidyukov. Yuri Selnikov took me over to General Baidyukov's apartment. I had a good conversation back and forth, and Yuri interpreted. He told me that at 6,000 feet they were in heavy icing. The front plexiglass in the nose compartment where the navigator and radio operator were had blown out, and they had gone to the rear of the aircraft. Also, they lost their antenna to their higher powered HF radio, and they had a lower powered HF radio in the back of the airplane that they were able to get some signal out. And I guess that's where he got most of his information on what was going on in the airplane. Years later, in fact, probably in the last 5 years, I've examined pictures of the exact airplane before it took off in Moscow, and on the pilot, below the pilot, on the left-hand side of the aircraft, there was 3 Venturi tubes, which would have been the vacuum to run their gyros. Venturi tubes are not heated. My opinion is they probably lost their gyros. If you look closely at the pitot tube, they probably, it obviously was not a heated pitot tube. They probably had no airspeed indicator. They probably had no gyros. If they were in heavy icing and cloud, there's no way they could have kept that airplane right side up. And my opinion is somewhere after the 300 miles on the Alaska side of the pole was their last report. So somewhere in that area, or the next 100 miles, my opinion is that they either spun in or crashed on the ice at that point. They had an oil leak on number 4, and that engine was shut down.
You've had experience flying over the polar cap and at the North Pole, because a lot of people would say, well, why didn't they use their compass?
It doesn't work.
Yeah, explain why a compass doesn't work.
Well, it's anything within 1,000 miles of the magnetic North Pole is compass unreliability. So the compass sort of wanders around, actually, they would have been just coming into that area when they got this side of the pole, because at that time the magnetic pole was near Joe Haven in the Canadian Arctic, east of Cambridge Bay, and Since then, it's actually moved over onto the Russian side of the pole. The magnetic pole is not even on the Canadian side anymore.
So we've heard from Ron about the Levanevsky search and some of the details about the aircraft and about flying over the pole. I'm Rob Stapleton for your Alaska Aviation Link.